Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn. And it is March 27th, 2019. Tonight, the first show on the impending Alberta election. Alberta votes on April 16th, but for Alberta future or Alberta past? Which Alberta will emerge afterwards? Will it be the Alberta that recognizes climate change, the duty of government to supply services and protect the rights of all citizens? Or will it be the Alberta of days past, with unconditional subservience to corporate will and mid-20th century social policy? The dire warnings from the usual suspects of socialism run amok under Rachel Notley simply haven't come true. Yes, poverty has been halved in 4 years. Yes, the infrastructure deficit lingering since Ralph Klein has been attacked with positive results. Yes, deficit spending is not going away anytime soon. The impending financial doom warnings simply don't hold up to hard statistics. Alberta still has the lowest tax burden by a wide margin in Canada. Nobody is lowering Alberta's credit rating, like Ontario's. And yes, detractors on the left have pointed out the failed promises with accuracy. But the sky has not fallen. In fact, it's gotten sunnier for a lot of people. Corporate media is ready for the coronation of Prince Jason, despite his train wreck of a leadership campaign being investigated by the RCMP, despite candidates dropping like flies, despite every sliver of policy announced being a throwback to anywhere between 1948 and 1992, despite every campaign appearance by Jason Kenney mysteriously having the Facebook Live feed drop as soon as it's question time. And in this mess, Stephen Mandel of the Alberta Party, David Kahn of the Alberta Liberal Party, and Derek Fildebrandt of the Freedom Conservative Party try to attract some attention wherever and however they can. Some constituencies in Alberta will have up to 8 names on the ballot, yet it is 2 parties that get all the notice. Now, this opening episode on the Alberta election will look at what the parties have promised so far and what they have warned Albertans about everybody else. And the band played on. The first thing I want to mention is the current nominations counts. There are 87 ridings in Alberta. The Alberta Advantage Party has candidates in 21 of 87. The Alberta Independence Party, 56 of 87. The Alberta Party, all 87. The Communist Party, 4 of 87. The Freedom Conservative Party, 25 of 87. The Alberta Green Party, 28 of 87. The Alberta Liberal Party, 54 of 87. The Alberta New Democrats, 87. Reform Party, 1 of 87. And the United Conservative Party, currently 86 out of 87. We know why that is. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the third to fifth parties in attention and support. Anybody below that, sorry, not getting any of my airtime. You're all the same anyway. And then we'll go to the two heavyweights. I mean, let's face it, there's only two parties that have a chance of government in this election. But it's not just that simple. Now, what I will be referring to for the promises made, and when we get to the NDP promises kept, the Edmonton Journal has a Alberta election 2019 promises forum that is updated when necessary. Emma Graney, Claire Clancy, Janet French are all involved. This is the last update from Monday, March 25th. Now, I'm going to start with the Alberta Party. Now, what they have promised as far as health goes. An Alberta Party government would make vaccinations mandatory for children enrolled in publicly funded schools. Expand provincial health care coverage to include annual dental checkups for all children under 12 and require fluoridation of municipal drinking water. It would also introduce one provincial picture ID card for all government services, healthcare, driver's license, Alberta WIN card, etc., and launch a digital government identification app. Okay. Oil and gas. Now, Alberta Party leader Stephen Mandel also wants to establish a division within the Economic Development and Trade Ministry to change the conversation around and social acceptance of Alberta's energy industry through a proactive, positive, and productive method that will move public opinion, not further isolate Albertan opportunity. Well, isn't that exactly what Notley's doing with her pipeline propaganda? Education. Mandel promised an Alberta Party government would double the number of educational assistants in the province. He also wants to increase funding for inclusive education by 50%, pledging to bump funding for school boards to aid students with disabilities and challenges to $690 million a year. Mandel also promised to fund student enrollment growth in the same school year students show up, funding the Alberta NDP restored when it formed government in 2015. Childcare. The Alberta Party would create a $1 billion voucher system to offset childcare costs for those who can least afford them. Families earning between $30,000 and $49,999 a year would pay no more than $5 a day for daycare. The subsidy would decrease as family income rises to a maximum combined income of $110,000 a year. Those are the official promises. Now I turn to the Alberta Party website, where I was able to gather some of their official statements on their policy. I have a few position statements here. I just want to say on a personal note, and I'm certainly not the only person in Edmonton who feels this way. As long as the Alberta Party has Stephen Mandel as a leader, goodbye. Thanks for coming. Regardless, The position statement from the Alberta Party on Indigenous rights. The Alberta Party recognizes the spirit and the intent of the treaties entered into between the Crown and First Nations. The Alberta Party acknowledges and supports the inherent right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples and commits to supporting them in building their nations. The Alberta Party commits to work with Indigenous communities at every stage to develop a path forward to fulfill and realize the intent of UNDRIP. There's a lot of statements, all in the same vein. They're going to enter into mutually agreed upon processes with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit about just about everything under the sun. However, most of these issues, especially the funding of said issues, is federal jurisdiction. So it's nice to appear friendly, but you can't do much about it, can you? Now, further on healthcare from the Alberta Party. I always like to look at the way they frame it to set up for what they're about to tell you. This is from the Alberta Party website. Alberta spends nearly half of the provincial budget on healthcare. Without addressing the continuing increases in healthcare costs, we will never achieve fiscal sustainability. Alberta Health has consistently exceeded its annual budget by hundreds of millions of dollars per year since 2013, showing a poor ability to plan. The Alberta Party caucus has proposed a different way of doing things, charting a path to financial stability, encouraging innovation in the healthcare sector, and making sure the quality of our system rises to meet the needs of Albertans. More specifically, review all unfilled Alberta Health Services management positions. Positions unfilled for longer than 1 year will be eliminated and removed from the budget. That's not anything new. Create a wellness strategy focused on mental health, long-term care, and chronic conditions like dementia that will help keep people healthier and allow them to live fulfilling lives in their community for as long as possible. Develop practices that allow trained and licensed healthcare professionals, such as members of EMS or nurse practitioners, more discretion in directing medical care. Deliver cost savings by reforming EMS dispatch and practices so that paramedics are able to spend more time in our communities and less time in the hospital. That's been an ongoing issue for a long time now. Conduct a review to eliminate duplication and redundancies. Same old. Empower frontline healthcare professionals to make changes that enhance service delivery, improve patient outcomes, and reduce costs. It's kind of a paradox. Review and identify real estate owned by Alberta Health Services that is underutilized and divest properties where there is no plan to use them again. So no investments are allowed. Create more long-term beds, more options for rehabilitation, and more flexibility to receive treatment at home. Many patients treated in acute care facilities would be better served transitioning to appropriate care. Okay, well, and nothing ground-shaking there. There's nothing really priced out or detailed either, just a bitch list. Children First Plan from the Alberta Party. The Children First Plan includes a major expansion of direct financial support to lower and middle-income families to cover the costs of licensed daycare and out-of-school care programs, a caregiver tax credit, and the creation of more affordable, high-quality childcare spaces throughout the province. Far more lower and middle-income families will receive financial support to cover the costs of licensed childcare through a new voucher program. The voucher can be used at any licensed childcare and will provide a subsidy of up to 100% of the cost of a childcare cost. The NDP's $25 a day childcare proposal covers only 7,200 and some spaces. Our Children First plan applies to all licensed childcare spaces in the province. There are over 260,000 Albertan children and more than 100,000 Albertan families to whom our program would apply. Well, of course, since this came out, the NDP has announced improvements, so that 7,200 number means nothing now. This voucher will follow the child, putting decision-making in the hands of families rather than the government. This accommodates differences in child care costs between care providers. Children up to age 6 will be covered. I find this interesting. This accommodates differences in child care costs between care providers. This brings the question of profitability into the picture. That's one thing with the government controlling where the spots are. That's removed. The subsidy will be income tested using a sliding scale calculation. For general reference, approximate maximum amounts that families would pay out of pocket for childcare under this plan after the subsidy are as follows. $0 to $30,000, no cost, $0 per day. $30,000 to $50,000, $5 per day maximum. $50,000 to $70,000, $10 per day maximum. $70,000 to $90,000, $20 per day maximum. $90,000 to $110,000 household income, $30 per day maximum. Also notice under this plan, after subsidy. This suggests that the upfront costs may still be the responsibility of the parent. That's not clear to me. It is expected parents attending post-secondary education and those earning minimum wage will receive a 100% subsidy of their childcare costs. This represents a massive expansion of the current childcare subsidy program in a way that supports the creation of more licensed childcare options based on local demand. Far more families will qualify for a subsidy than under the present system, and families who currently qualify for a subsidy will receive far more financial support. Again, to me, that's another hint that this is about opening up the business side of childcare, not necessarily providing it. A caregiver tax credit. For families with children who do not use a licensed childcare option or do not make use of the voucher program, a new income-tested caregiver tax credit will be created to help recognize the costs involved in raising children. That's all I have to say. Very vague. A comprehensive review of Alberta's child care legislation will be undertaken with a view to making it easier to create more licensed, safe, affordable, high-quality child care spaces. A new investment credit will be established to encourage employers to create licensed child care spaces for children of employees. So now we're going to subsidize corporations having on-site daycare. A new ministry will place a focus on early learning and early childhood in Alberta. It will work proactively and in collaboration with other ministries to encourage the healthy development of children during their early years. It is well established that preventative efforts during a child's early years help bring about better outcomes. Okay, so in the first half of that position paper, it's all about the parents having choice. It's all about getting the parents the ability. And yet with the new ministry, you're going to control early childhood on what level. You're talking about creating more daycare spaces which will, quote unquote, stimulate the economy. Yet you're going to create a ministry? How are you saving money at all? The Alberta Party position statement on the carbon tax. This is a little different than most anybody else. Albertans need an environmental plan tailored to the unique aspects of our province and the needs of everyday Albertans. What's that code for? The Alberta Party caucus shadow budget for 2019 proposes to exempt homes, businesses, farms, and nonprofits from the carbon tax. Revenues would be offset by cuts to personal and corporate income taxes. The rebate system would be fixed so that the genuinely disadvantaged would get rebates, whereas currently almost 2/3 of Albertans receive them. Finally, any excess revenues would be applied directly to the provincial debt instead of being directed to general revenues. That is not easy to do. It would require the change of quite a few standing traditional rules, especially where the money gets directed to. I'm curious who exactly would pay the carbon tax then. Homes don't, businesses don't, farms don't, nonprofits don't. Who does? The government? We don't have to choose between our province's natural beauty and a strong economy. We can conserve the environment while making sure that Alberta's economic engines are firing on all cylinders. Albertan families can enjoy the parks that fill our cities and towns without worrying about their food on the table or how to pay rent this month. Wow. That's about it. So you can see where the Alberta Party sits. They are a little bit right of center. But then with the leader they have, that's to be expected. Not much more to say about them. The Alberta Liberals, led by David Kahn, who's likable, he's bright, he's intelligent, but he also doesn't rock the status quo. And we'll see that as we look at what their positions are. First to the list of what's been promised. Alberta Liberal leader David Kahn said in a year-end interview his party's platform will likely concentrate on jobs, the economy, and of course, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. The party passed a raft of policies last April. Some of those were rolled back, but party policies so far include a pilot project for a universal basic income as a poverty reduction strategy, mandatory public school class size caps, and more funding for mental health supports and supports for inclusive education. The party also wants to implement an immediate ban on the practice of conversion therapy. Kahn also unveiled an Indigenous platform, including education and justice reforms, the creation of a regional Indigenous Child Protection Office, Indigenous language immersion programs, and adding 6 new seats to the Alberta legislature for Indigenous peoples members of the Legislative Assembly. That sets him apart from everybody else, without a doubt. Now I turn to their website, albertaliberal.com. I guess I should have said, if you didn't guess, albertaparty.ca for the Alberta Party's propaganda. The Alberta Liberal propaganda is at albertaliberal.com. Now, on to immigration, which is not completely in the federal jurisdiction, but close to. The Alberta Liberals will improve access to foreign credential upgrades. This will help new Canadians find work in their field of expertise and break down barriers to their success. It will also address skilled labor shortages in Alberta. Our plan will strengthen our economy. We will help new Canadians integrate more easily into Canadian society. We will boost settlement funding, assisting new Canadians in making Alberta home. We will also invest in adult education and English as a second language programs, ESL. This will make it easier for immigrants to communicate with their fellow Canadians. We will bolster support for organizations like the Centre for Newcomers and the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. They help coordinate and educate skilled newcomers and find them employment. We will make it easier for immigrants to access Alberta government services. We will provide those services in more languages. Telephone service that allows new Canadians to speak to government agents with the help of a translator. Well, that all sounds very reasonable and makes sense. There's not really much you can say against that. That right there does demonstrate where a province can make a real difference in the federal immigration program. But there are some specific new details there, and none of it's costed. Keeping on staff translators into many different languages doesn't sound all that cheap to me. What about the carbon tax policy from the Alberta Liberals? When he released this policy, Leader Khan stated, "We must all fight climate change. It is one of the most important issues of our time." Alberta Liberals are making this a priority in the 2019 election. We must all change our behavior. It is not just a responsibility of heavy emitters. Every single ton of carbon we emit into the atmosphere carries a cost to society. We all bear the cost. Well, so much for the way Stephen Mandel and the Alberta Party look at it. Alberta Liberals will make the carbon tax revenue neutral. Economists agree that market-based approaches are the most cost-effective tool available to governments to address greenhouse gas emissions. This strikes a balance between protecting our environment and protecting our economy. We will adopt enhanced rebates for low-income Albertans. We will also lower income taxes. The amount will be equal to the carbon tax Albertans pay. Our revenue-neutral carbon tax is efficient, equitable, and protects the environment. Okay, this is right in line with what the Alberta Party is saying. But if it's completely revenue-neutral like this, then there is no cost. Where's the deterrent? Where is the whole point of a carbon levy when it doesn't cost you any more? The Alberta Liberals do not support the NDP government version of a carbon tax. Our plan is different. We will be transparent in our reporting to all Albertans. Unlike the NDP government, we will fully inform the legislature on the progress being made in reducing carbon emissions. Apparently, Mr. Khan is trying to sell the point that data that you gather for reductions in emission based on a tax that's been operational for less than 2 years, you can get overnight or something. We will not cancel the commitments currently paid for by the carbon tax. We will explain that funding structure in our comprehensive tax reform plan later. The Alberta Liberal policy will boost the economy and safeguard our environment. We believe a revenue-neutral carbon tax is needed to combat climate change. Well, I disagree, Mr. Khan. Like I said, if there's no penalty, if you're not feeling the pinch, why are you going to use less? Ridiculous. I can see that actually being used by businesses, because then they can take the reduction in corporate tax based on their carbon levy, and they could be getting a rebate above what they're paying. It sounds shady to me, but that's my opinion. Now, what about the Alberta Liberal Party energy policy? This is a complete endorsement of the status quo fairy tales. 100%. Alberta's energy industry is the heart of our economy. We need to support it, not just for ourselves, but for our environment. We need to make sure we're creating the most ethical and environmentally friendly oil possible, so the world doesn't turn to dirtier energy sources like coal. Balancing environment and economy won't be easy, but we're up to the task. Using coal as a comparison against diluted bitumen is ridiculous. The Trans Mountain Expansion Project is the safest way to get our oil to new markets and get a better price for it. We must diversify our customer base, and twinning and upgrading an existing pipeline is the most responsible way to do it. So again, the assumption that there actually are foreign markets. There are no markets in Asia, David. Get used to it. There is no shortcut to fulfilling the constitutional duty to consult. Declaring the project already under federal jurisdiction a federal undertaking will not change its status or get it built. There is no way to override Section 35 of the Constitution. First Nations must be properly consulted at the highest levels and their concerns meaningfully accommodated. The project will also not be built by attacking Ottawa, banning BC wine, threatening to shut off oil exports, or firing up a war room to battle the feds. This will only hurt our own industry and province. I would tend to agree with Mr. Khan there. However, we cannot trust the federal government to get this right. Alberta Liberals will immediately demand an interim report that details their efforts to comply with the Federal Court of Appeal's decision and the status of the consultation process with affected First Nations in Alberta and British Columbia. Albertans deserve to be treated like adults and be informed of the federal government's progress to date on moving the Trans Mountain Expansion Project forward on their behalf. Really? It's all for Alberta, is it? Okay, good to know. Thousands of jobs and billions of revenue dollars are at stake. All we have is silence. Albertans have a right to be stressed. Another delay could further sink our economy. Oh my God! Whew. So he's sounding just like the two big boys on the block for this election here. He doesn't stop there, though. Bill C-69 is deeply flawed and must be amended. The world has changed. Today's international investors demand not only regulatory certainty, but also socially responsible investing. There is an opportunity for Canada to turn the tables and go from a lack of investment in our energy industry to attracting increasing investment by demonstrating that we are respecting Indigenous and human rights and addressing the environment and sustainability with every project we undertake. Yeah, that's what C-69 is for. Alberta Liberals will join with Alberta's energy industry to demand specific amendments to this bill that balance economic, social, and environmental concerns, including removing project approval powers from the purview of the Federal Environment Minister and depoliticizing approvals, modernizing and improving, not replacing, the National Energy Board, and get this, and retaining its well-established extensively court-reviewed process, and extensive jurisprudence. Including positive aspects of national and regional growth, prosperity, and competitiveness as public interest factors. Embracing opportunities for Indigenous economic reconciliation, increasing certainty around timeframes and clock stoppages. Well, as has been mentioned many times on this show in the past, especially with the esteemed Robin Allen, most of the clock stoppages, like over 90% in an approval process, are because of the applicant. Introducing innovative approaches to minimize timelines. That's called removing qualifications. Establishing clear policy in the areas of climate change and Indigenous rights. He ties more into energy. He ain't done yet. Canada's equalization formula, created by Mr. Kenney and Mr. Harper, is unfair to energy-producing provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan. But a referendum based on threatening separation will not give us power to demand changes or amend Canada's Constitution. Albertans are generous and care about our neighbours in Confederation, but we expect fairness. An Alberta Liberal government will demand the current formula be amended to treat hydro-producing provinces' revenue generated by their hydro crown corporations the same way we treat Alberta's oil and gas royalties. Or else, we will set up an Alberta Crown Corporation that will collect energy royalties and remove them from the current equalization formula calculations, making it fair for everyone. Oh yeah, we're going to skirt the rules to make it fair. We will also demand an improvement to the mechanism that provides financial help to provinces in time of economic need, whether they are usually have or have not provinces. Oh yeah. So for all that time Alberta was banking all that coin and then the ass fell out of the market again, there was nothing in the cupboard. So Ottawa should make up for that. Good to see you're so big on responsibility, Mr. Khan. So right there, you know, he's picking out Newfoundland and Labrador, Quebec, and soon to be Manitoba because hydro is exempt. Well, hydro doesn't have anywhere near the environmental impact, though it still does have one. It's just bitching and complaining. This is all it is. I mean, just go back to the first sentence. Created by Mr. Harper and Mr. Kenney. There's where your problem is. We will put an end to government boondoggles and interference in the market. Alberta has wasted billions over the years on interventionist boondoggles. If more refineries are economically feasible in Alberta, let's let markets decide. Well, why do you think we don't have any? We will establish an independent panel of experts to review and make recommendations on any proposed future taxpayer-financed value-added investment in the energy sector. Yeah, that's what's happening now. We will cancel the NDP's costly and risky oil-by-rail car shipping plan. Government should only intervene in the market when there is a major failure. An Alberta Liberal government will change our fiscal structure to create a business-friendly environment to allow businesses to grow, build, and employ Albertans. That's open to a lot of interpretation. But here's, like, when I said Mr. Khan on energy is full status quo propagandist, here you go right here. Canada needs greater energy independence, and Alberta needs access to markets. A pipeline east just makes sense. We need to reignite the Energy East pipeline project and replace oil imports in eastern Canada with more ethical and environmentally responsible made in Alberta oil. We demand the federal government show national leadership and restart this important national infrastructure project. It's a win-win-win. No, Mr. Khan, it's a lie, lie, lie. Who's going to build it? TransCanada is no longer interested in Keystone XL Plan B. Governments do not import oil. Corporations do. And you're going to call diluted bitumen more ethical and environmentally responsible? You're full of shit. Education, the Alberta Liberal Party. Alberta Liberals will put an end to overcrowded classrooms by implementing flexible classroom size caps and hiring more teachers. Reducing classroom sizes increases the academic performance of students. Yet for almost 20 years, successive governments have failed to meet Alberta's class size guidelines. Some math classes have upwards of 45 students in them, and there are gym classes with 60 students. The money that has been spent on reducing class sizes has been poorly tracked, according to Alberta's Auditor General, and failed to create results. The Alberta Liberal plan will introduce flexible class size caps that make it mandatory for the government and school boards to keep class sizes small. Well, depends where that cap is. Is this similar to the NDP's oil sands cap for emissions, which is set at about 150% of what we currently have? Hire as many teachers as needed to meet the class size requirements. Phase in the caps over time, focusing on grades K to 3 first, where class size is most strongly tied to performance. Work with school boards and educators to make sure class size caps make sense locally, and ensure money allocated for reducing class sizes goes towards that goal. Alberta Liberals will tackle youth mental health issues through a significant increase in funding for mental health services in our schools. 70% of adults with mental illness had recognizable signs in childhood that were inadequately assessed and treated. The current curriculum review isn't perfect, but it has made good changes. It would be a waste of taxpayer dollars to throw it out. We support the curriculum changes, but are calling for further improvements, including teaching K to 12 students about emotional and mental wellness, expanding financial literacy education, and updating age-respectful early education on LGBTQ2S+ issues. The Alberta Liberals will expand trades and professional training in high school and junior high to reduce the risk of skilled labor shortfalls and create more options for students. How they plan to do this at such an early age, I have no idea. It makes no sense to me. We'll invest in more supports for students with extra needs, including hiring more educational assistants and providing more funding for cognitive testing and individualized education plans. We'll ensure funding for special needs students follow the student it is intended for, including for those students who are homeschooled due to difficulties they've encountered in the public system. We'll also immediately ban the use of seclusion rooms and mandate closer monitoring of all funding directed towards inclusive education. The seclusion room issue has been dealt with the government. This is just a little bit of a, we think it should be faster, I do believe. That's about it. Alberta Liberals will phase out school fees. Nothing is more important in education than equality of opportunity. But school fees disadvantage low-income families. They will cease to exist under an Alberta Liberal government. charter schools are part of the public system and provide valuable specialized programs. But this NDP government has treated them and their students like second-class citizens. An Alberta Liberal government will eliminate school and busing fees for charter school students and ensure charter school infrastructure is funded in an equal and fair way. That I completely disagree with. Alberta Liberals on healthcare. Sustainable public healthcare requires a shift in thinking. We need to focus on keeping people healthy instead of just treating them when they are sick or injured. A renewed emphasis on preventative care, nutrition, lifestyle, poverty, education, and mental health will bring about better results and reduce long-term costs. Sounds good. How do you do it? Alberta Liberals will implement the 32 recommended changes from Alberta's Valuing Mental Health report. To accomplish this, we will follow the recommendation of the Canada Mental Health Commission and allocate 9% of all healthcare spending towards mental health and addictions. 20% of Albertans will be affected by mental illness in their lives, but less than 6% of the health budget currently goes towards mental health and addictions. Alberta is underspending in this critical area to the tune of over $500 million. Now, of course, talking about everything they're going to increase, the next paragraph, to get health spending under control, we must make long-term investments in nutrition, health education, screening, and prevention, as well as greater focus on team-based community care. Alberta Liberals are committed to implementing best practices from across the globe to implement a 15-minute patient transfer time from ambulance to ER. EMS has been mismanaged in Alberta. Red alerts, no ambulances available, excessive overtime, and long emergency room hallway wait times for paramedics have increased costs and compromised care. The opioid crisis. 2 Albertans die each day to opioid and other overdoses. Much more can and must be done to curb Alberta's opioid crisis. We're committed to declaring a public health state of emergency to better mobilize cross-departmental resources and allow for more cross-department cooperation in combating this drug epidemic. In addition, we will expand the number of safe consumption sites and drug rehab beds and implement a 4 pillars drug strategy that includes prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and enforcement. This is a very big public difference from everybody else. Flat out saying more safe consumption sites, more rehab beds. People suffering from drug addiction and abuse aren't criminals. They're ill. Punitive action worsens the stigma around addiction and makes it harder for people to seek help. Addicts need help, not handcuffs. We support following the lead of Portugal and decriminalizing the possession of small quantities of drugs in order to better combat addiction. Well, nobody else has come anywhere near that. And it has not been mentioned in media at a lack of access to dental care isn't just about cosmetics or even comfort and can result in serious health implications such as infections and even death. Alberta Liberals will unveil both short-term and long-term strategies for addressing the lack of access to dental care in Alberta. The Alberta Liberals will work with the federal government and our partners in Confederation on the implementation of a national pharmacare plan that provides access to affordable drugs for all Albertans. So, there's definitely some different features in the health care policy of the Alberta Liberals. Now I will move on to the Freedom Conservative Party. I turn back again to the What's Promised article. As the newest political party with a sitting member of the legislature, the Freedom Conservatives have a job ahead of them to cobble together a robust platform ahead of the election. Leader Derek Fildebrandt has unveiled the centerpiece of his party's platform. Alberta's government must come to an agreement with the feds on major constitutional reform or face an independence referendum. For him, this includes the right to govern ourselves within our own provincial jurisdiction like Quebec does, and keeping more of Alberta's wealth and decision-making at home. As far as energy goes, Fildebrandt said he wants to end the curtailment policy brought in by Notley to reduce the oil differential last year, calling the move intrusive on a free energy market. He also said an FCP government would demand that Ottawa sell the Trans Mountain pipeline back to the private sector immediately. Well, too bad nobody wants to buy it. And demand a repeal of the controversial federal Bill C-69. The FCP also wants to kill the carbon tax and join court actions against the federal carbon pricing plan. Finally, Fildebrandt said if elected, the FCP would allow coal plants to remain open if they meet reasonable environmental standards, as opposed to phasing out coal power, which has been a pillar NDP policy. Interesting that Mr. Fildebrandt fails to mention that over 2/3 of the coal plant closures in Alberta were legislated by the Harper government. The Notley government has merely accelerated the closure of the remaining plants. Details. So let's look to what Derek Flusterbrandt and the FCP have to say. I turn to their website, freedomconservativeparty.ca. Equality or independence for Alberta. Alberta has been forced to a crossroads, and only two honorable options remain for us: equality or independence. Accepting the status quo, regardless of who rules in Ottawa and Edmonton, will see Albertans' anger wax and wane, but it will keep Albertans as a second-class people and a quasi-colony to be milked for vote buying elsewhere. The math is simple. Alberta has most of the money and little of the votes. Whomever resides in the Prime Minister's office will only tilt the degree to which Alberta is plundered. The Freedom Conservative Party is committed as our most important election pledge that if Alberta's next government cannot negotiate an agreement recognizing a place of equality and honor for Alberta within 1 year of this election, then Albertans will decide for themselves in a vote on independence. What does equality look like? Well, for the FCP, it means ending equalization, a hard cap on net wealth transfers from Alberta to other provinces, equal and elected Senate representation, and strengthening the now worthless constitutional protections for free trade and market access across provinces. It means Alberta having the same rights as Quebec to establish our own police force, an Alberta pension plan, an Alberta employment insurance plan, directly administer the Firearms Act, and establish our own immigration system. First of all, Derek, Alberta has a chance to establish their own police every time the RCMP contract comes up for renewal. And the last time that happened, the Redford government signed it again. Okay? The Alberta Exchange Commission looked at establishing an Alberta pension plan and deemed it not as good as CPP. As far as the immigration system and the Firearms Act go, that could risk funding from the federal government to programs in Alberta. But, give me my freedoms. None of these demands ask for special treatment or favors, only equality. If Alberta's demands for equality cannot be met within 1 year of the next provincial election, then Albertans should decide directly for themselves in a referendum between the status quo and independence. It is our hope that the prospect of independence will convince Ottawa that pennies on the dollar handouts will simply no longer do, but that threat must be real and credible. The Freedom Conservative Party is the only party in Alberta that believes that independence must now be on the table. It is something that we do not do lightly. A reformed equal confederation is preferable to independence, but independence is unquestionably better than continuing to live under the status quo. Make up your mind, shithead. Confederation is the status quo. You think a vote by citizens of Alberta is going to secede us from Confederation? Quit lying. Then comes the illogical comparisons that don't take into effect a completely different economic situation that would exist for Alberta if it were not part of Canada. An independent Alberta would have a GDP per capita in the very top tier of nations, in the same class as Singapore, Switzerland, and Norway, moving us up from 34th within Canada to 9th. An independent Alberta would be landlocked like a provincial Alberta, but would retain an extra $20 billion net in taxes a year and hold considerable leverage in negotiating with a BC that surely desires Canadian access as much as Alberta desires coastal access. Really, I guess that's why so much rail traffic from the Pacific to central Canada goes through the northern United States, right? Idiot. An independent Alberta would negotiate its own trade relationships, unencumbered by Ottawa's obsession with sex, race, and carbon, and the main areas of disagreement with the United States: steel, aluminum, and supply management of dairy. So it's Canada's fault Trump's a fucking idiot? So that's their big selling point, independence. But just wait, it gets better. The Freedom Conservative Party has announced what they're calling an education policy. And they title it World-Class Education. For grades kindergarten to 12, they would equally fund all students at certified public, private, and separate schools in Alberta and guarantee funding for homeschooling. That's 100% funding for private schools. Pass a Parents' Bill of Rights to guarantee choice and control over education. Ridiculous. Cancel the NDP's new curriculum and replace it with measured learning targets, allowing school boards to set their own curriculums. Respect the right of private educational institutions to practice their own religious or cultural beliefs without discrimination. So, Wild West. I have a metaphor for you, Derek. How come wherever, doesn't matter where anybody is, not just in Alberta, but in Canada, when people learn how to play hockey, the rules are the same. Maybe so you can go play hockey competitively anywhere? Does that make sense? Now apply it to your idea for education, you fucking idiot. Colleges and universities. revoke funding for institutions that do not protect freedoms of speech, association, and assembly. We know what that means. We've seen this before. Make student union membership voluntary. We've heard this before. We know what that means. Allow post-secondary institutions to partner with K-12 schools to specialize in vocational training. In many ways, they already do. Thanks, Derek. Now, about their field of candidates. I turn to albertapolitics.ca, David Klimenhaga, March 22nd. The good news for Alberta's Freedom Conservative Party is that it's recruited a national figure as one of its candidates. The bad news for the FCP may be the national figure in question is Neil Bernard Hancock, better known as Bernard the Roughneck. A 3-paragraph story on Mr. Hancock's nomination appeared on the Everything GP, that's Grand Prairie, Everything GP online news site yesterday, with a quote from FCP leader and sole party MLA Derek Fildebrandt saying he is excited by the nomination and expressing the hope Bernard will be a strong voice for the people of Grand Prairie, and I look forward to serving with him in the Alberta legislature. The 30-something Mr. Hancock first appeared on the national scene in September 2016 when he showed up on Parliament Hill dressed in coveralls and a hard hat, complete with streaks of grime on his face, as if he'd just wandered in from an oil drilling rig in the middle of Wellington Street. He was in the company of Mark Scholes, the media-savvy president of the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, a man long associated with Alberta's Wild Rose Party and one of the brains behind the online Oil Respect campaign. Also there for the photo op was Lakeland Conservative Member of Parliament Shannon Stubbs, former Wild Rose leader Danielle Smith's Chief of Staff from 2010 to 2012. That event went swimmingly for all participants. Media lapped it up when Mr. Hancock said, "I'm not a guy from Calgary in a suit. I'm not a guy who's knowledgeable about public policy or the processes that go on in buildings like this. I'm a roughneck." Within a few days, though, it was revealed Mr. Hancock was a talented amateur thespian who had majored in media, communications, history, and political sciences at Bishop's University in Quebec. By November of that year, according to his own account, Mr. Hancock was Bernard the ex-roughneck, no longer working in that field. Since then, he seems not to have taken part in another stunt similar, and for a while he disappeared completely. Well, no more. Bernard the Roughneck is back, an official candidate of an official political party. Notwithstanding Mr. Hancock's tendency to say exactly whatever he thinks, a little more bluntly than the art of politics demands, Mr. Fildebrandt reassured Mr. Klimenhaga, who's writing this, he has no worries about his party's newest candidate staying on message. Our candidates are not trained SEALs, Mr. Fildebrandt explained. They are free to speak their minds and vote freely if elected. Candidates don't have to be a brain clone of the leader. That said, Mr. Fildebrandt himself had a bit of a reputation as a loose cannon back in the days when he was a member of the Wild Rose and UCP caucuses. Former Wild Rose leader Brian Jean tried to fire him from the party, and opposition leader Jason Kenney succeeded where Mr. Jean had failed and sent the Strathmore Brooks MLA packing from the UCP caucus last year. Now, Mr. Hancock won the Grand Prairie nomination by acclamation. In response to questions about whether he was now living in Grand Prairie and where he's working, Mr. Hancock replied to Mr. Klimenhaga, "Piss off." So what happens if Mr. Fildebrandt loses on April 16th and the good voters of Grand Prairie elect Mr. Hancock? he becomes the acting leader, right? There will be an all-candidates meeting in Grand Prairie on April 9th. Mark your calendars. Should be good for a laugh. That's all I got to say about the Freedom Conservative Party. More than enough. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. Now, I will turn to the party of government, the New Democrats. Again, I go back to the What Have They Promised article by Emma Graney, Claire Clancy, Janet French, Edmonton Journal, updated as we go along. Just give me 1 second here. Why? Okay. Just checking this stuff. What? Okay. Isn't this fun? You get to listen to my babbling while I deal with social media regarding the show being live. Alrighty. Given the NDP is currently the governing party, it's likely to run on its record. Promises kept. Flipping back through the party's 2015 election platform, Rachel Notley's government has completed the vast majority of items, including increasing Alberta's minimum wage to $15 per hour, rolling out $25 a day daycare, and creating a status of women's ministry. It also raised Alberta's corporate tax to 12% from 10%, implemented strategies for energy efficiency and renewable energy, and promised to work with Indigenous and federal governments to resolve land claims, such as the Lubicon Lake Band settlement. Promises not kept. What it hasn't done is phased in all-day kindergarten or ban gas drilling in urban areas, which was an issue recently raised in Lethbridge. In 2015, the NDP also promised a Resource Owners' Rights Commission within 6 months of taking office, which would report to the Premier and Legislature on measures to promote greater processing of energy resources. That idea included acting on recommendations within the first year as government. Hasn't happened. Other promises fell below expectations, such as an infrastructure sunshine list to make project priorities more transparent. The list was released in 2016 and included a list of 111 unfunded capital projects in alphabetical order, giving Albertans no indication as to which projects would be selected first. What is the NDP fighting for? They remained tight-lipped about their platform until the writ dropped, with Notley only saying her party would build the province and fight for things, not against them. That includes the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, but also public health care, education, and the environment. On the economy, the NDP has for a long time pushed the line that Alberta's recovery must reach everyone, so you can expect ideas around job creation and diversification. It may prove a tough sell for Albertans, though, with the latest employment figures showing a higher unemployment rate despite the creation of more jobs. Then there's the latest fiscal update. Although the projected deficit fell by $1.9 billion, the Conference Board of Canada has predicted Alberta will have the lowest projected growth rate of any province. In her first campaign promise, Notley said a re-elected NDP government would double incentives for petrochemical and upgrading projects from $3.6 billion to $7 billion over the next decade. It carries on the NDP program that was a pivotal part of Notley's energy diversification plan as Premier. The promised funding would unlock $75 billion in global value-added petroleum investment and create 70,000 jobs by 2030, says the NDP. The incentives include royalty credits, loan guarantees, and grants. On healthcare, Notley has doubled down on the message that the NDP will protect Alberta from American-style healthcare under the UCP. She announced that an NDP government would add 2,000 more long-term care beds, costing about $170 million. It follows a similar campaign promise in 2015 for 2,000 beds, something the NDP delivered on. Flood mitigation. Notley rolled out a flood mitigation strategy in Calgary, saying an NDP government would invest $1 billion from Alberta's climate leadership plan to build major infrastructure such as a reservoir on the Bow River. It builds on Notley's commitment to build the Springbank Dam. Of course, this is to prevent another disaster like Calgary had with the flood. Notice that the money is coming from the climate leadership plan. Where does that money come from? The carbon tax. So those are the big promises. The next thing I'm going to look at is an article by Jason Markusov in Maclean's. He's been covering the Alberta election. He does it basically on a daily basis. There's a Alberta Politics Insider morning newsletter that you can get by email. This is an article from Jason from March 25th, Monday. Why being boring could work for Rachel Notley. He refers to something we'll cover after this. Danielle Smith, the former Wildrose leader who almost won the 2012 election, has returned to her journalism roots as a radio host and sometimes columnist. In a piece in the Calgary Herald, Smith states, Jason Kenney is the choice of Albertans who revere former Premier Ralph Klein. The populist and pugnacious deficit slasher, while NDP's Rachel Notley harkens back to another Tory Premier, Peter Lougheed, the patrician Red Tory, who invested heavily in Alberta's culture and infrastructure and intervened to stoke the economy. Danielle Smith here breaks from her conservative commentary brethren who tend to simply decry Notley as socialist. I think most Albertans have been shocked to see how pragmatic she has governed, particularly as it concerns natural resources, Smith wrote. Notley herself repeatedly invokes Lougheed's name, and at her campaign kickoff made a point of wearing Tory blue instead of NDP orange. Kenney talks about restoring the Alberta Advantage, Klein's old marketing slogan. Smith reasons that Albertans are torn as to which approach they wish to revive. They want all the spending and Heritage Fund investment of the Lougheed era with all the low taxes and debt repayment of the Klein era. Trouble is, we can't have both. No kidding. Election, NDP candidate Kathleen Ganley was an unknown lawyer who ran her campaign out of her station wagon with no campaign manager and a rival who outspent her 30-1. And she won the election. This time, she's Alberta's Attorney General, has a well-staffed campaign office and a decent war chest, and may still lose her Calgary seat to a last-second fill-in candidate. The NDP used to have negligible organization in Alberta's largest city, but won most of the city seats regardless in 2015, as voters were drawn to Notley's personal magnetism and repelled from the Tories without needing a push. This time, many Calgary NDP incumbents will run proper full-throttle campaigns, but they're so far back in the individual polls in the traditionally conservative city, it might not matter unless Notley can lift them once again. Now, to that article by Danielle Smith. At this point, I will say that in the 2015 campaign, in Edmonton, not Calgary, there was one writer of note that was willing to speak the truth, that 44 years of progressive conservative rule had made Alberta a basket case on many issues. They simply didn't know how to do things correctly anymore, and they saw no incentive to do so. That was Paula Simons, who is now Senator Simons. That has carried on this time with people like Emma Graney and Janet French. They are being allowed to report facts, actual happenings. The opinion pieces are a whole other issue. As far as the Sun papers go, forget it. You want facts, don't buy the Sun. That's all there is to it. They don't have room for facts. They have too many people yelling at clouds. However, Danielle Smith in the Calgary Herald. This was on March 22nd, last Friday. I could read it like Danny, but I'm not going to. I'm going to ask you a question that I think may be a decent proxy to figure out who you are likely to vote for in Alberta election on April 16th. Who do you think was the best premier of Alberta? Peter Lougheed, Ralph Klein, or neither? If Lougheed, I bet you're voting for Notley. If Klein, my guess is you're voting for Kenny. If neither, well, there's a veritable smorgasbord to choose from in the Liberals, Alberta Party, Greens, Freedom Conservatives, and even the Alberta Independence Party, which, it will be a surprise to most, is likely to have more candidates than any of the other fringe parties. But there's no question the division of these two iconic past premiers are living on today, in the NDP and UCP respectively. Notley campaigned on the legacy of Lougheed in 2015. She governed in his spirit throughout the past 4 years. She even mentioned him in the last line of her campaign launch speech. This has been deliberate branding, and it's the reason Albertans who remember his reign find themselves so torn. Notley is, without question, the inheritor of the Lougheed tradition. Now, that's not to say he was a full-on socialist, but Notley isn't either. I think most Albertans have been shocked to see how pragmatic she has governed, particularly as it concerns natural resources. However, Lougheed clearly did believe that government could be a force for good and that it should actively intervene to steer the economy. Those were the glory days of government revenue, where resource revenues peaked at nearly $10,000 per person. Lougheed presided over a 7-fold increase in government spending, led by health, education, and social services. He also led a progressive agenda to tear down some of the remaining oppressive conventions of the social credit era around drinking and Sunday shopping, among others. On the business side, Lougheed is credited with saving Syncrude when it nearly collapsed in the mid-70s, and Alberta sold its shares in 1995 for a big profit. Who did that? Klein. And launched Alberta firmly into the bitumen business, which now makes up the lion's share of Alberta's resource revenues. Lougheed was at the ribbon cutting for the first ethylene plant in Joffre, launching Nova into creation as one of the world's largest ethylene and polyethylene production complexes. Even Pacific Western Airlines had some small profits before the Klein government sold it. Are you seeing the similarities yet? This is no doubt why Notley feels the confidence to keep spending on government programs and be a partner in business. She's doing it with gusto. Annual government spending has never been higher, and we have witnessed an array of loan guarantees, royalty breaks, and grants for refineries, petrochemicals, solar, and wind, with no doubt much more to come. But as we discovered in the two decades following Lougheed, overconfidence can lead to financial ruin, and there is always a hangover after a bender. No one brags about government trying to build cell phones through Novotel, which cost taxpayers $614 million. That was not Lougheed. Or prop up pulp mills, which cost $325 million. Not Lougheed. Or support gainers, which cost $209 million. Don Getty. Or the $440 million in the Swan Hills hazardous treatment plant. Ralph Klein. Or MagCan, whose abandoned magnesium smelter site Ms. Smith drives past every day, which cost the province $164 million. These government failures also paved the way for Ralph Klein, who I think of as the anti-Lougheed. He cut spending by 20%, including the cherished areas of health, education, and social services. He got out of the business of business and privatized registries, liquor stores, VLTs, and electricity. Yeah, it's worked so well. He contracted out laundry services, road maintenance, driver training, to name just a few. When he got into surplus, he cut taxes. The biggest smile we ever saw on his face was when he held up the sign declaring Alberta debt-free. I believe Albertans want both. They want all the spending and heritage fund investment of the Lougheed era, all the low taxes and debt repayment of the Klein era. Trouble is, we can't have both. This time, even getting back to balanced budgets has to be done without the benefit of a substantial boost from oil, natural gas, or bitumen royalties. There are tough decisions ahead. Are Albertans ready for it? Well, depends what colored glasses you want to look through, Danny. Now, to react, part of what got that column written, as mentioned, was the doubling of the money that the Notley government is prepared to put into value-added petroleum investments. This is from the NDP website now, albertandp.ca. It's time we start acting like resource owners once again in Alberta, as we did under Premier Lougheed. While Jason Kenney plots the largest corporate tax giveaway in Alberta history and hopes for a return to the past, we're taking the bull by the horns and building for the future. Our plan will secure more of the international value-added petroleum investment that passed us by for decades under successive conservative leaders who dropped the ball on Lougheed's vision. Just that sentence there, I have to say, I agree with that completely. And we have numbers, which of course are from their side of the fence, about how much it's going to cost, how much it's going to bring in, blah, blah, blah. They do have something to back up their metric. Work is already well underway on Notley's Made in Alberta Energy Diversification Plan. To date, nearly $13 billion in private capital investment is being leveraged by $1 billion in incentives, creating over 11,000 jobs as 5 new petrochemical and upgrading projects move forward. Fair enough. Last Thursday, regarding forestry, the NDP government's capital investment tax credits provided almost $4.5 million in capital investment tax credits to help toll coal industries buy more modern equipment to modernize its mills in High Prairie, Slave Lake, and High Level. UCP MLAs voted against this program, with their members calling it picking winners and losers. Rachel Notley and her team continue to fight for forestry workers in Alberta. Then we get into a little bit of the propaganda. As Environment Minister, Shannon Phillips went to Ottawa with an industry-heavy delegation to tell Trudeau that Alberta would only participate in federal demands on restoring caribou herds if the federal government started to look at the impacts their demands have on forestry workers. She secured federal money to study the economic impact on the forestry sector and made it clear to the federal government they would need to commit to supports for workers before any more caribou protection work went forward. So, like Daniel Smith said, like I've said, this socialism run amok, it's not happening. It's not happening at all. Everything they do regarding money and industry is done with them, which is something that Peter Lougheed didn't always do. Now, to refute what I said at the start with the Alberta Party and Stephen Mandel bitching about the Notley daycare plan, this is also from last week. This is about the $25 a day childcare, the expansion. Premier Notley introduced a plan to allow more parents to join the workforce by capping childcare fees at $25 a day and adding 13,000 more spaces across Alberta. Safe, quality, affordable childcare is good for families, and it's key to unlocking Alberta's economic potential. Finding safe, quality, affordable childcare shouldn't be a lottery. It should be something families in Alberta can depend on. If I'm re-elected as your premier, childcare will be the Medicare of the 21st century. See, there's a good tagline. Alberta currently has the largest workforce participation gender gap in Canada. Quebec introduced a subsidized childcare program in the 1990s that increased the labor participation rate for women, increased overall employment by 1.8%, and GDP by 1.7%. Estimates show that the expansion of $25 a day childcare in Alberta would increase employment and add $5.95 billion a year to our GDP. Now, Notley piloted this $25 a day childcare 2 years ago. Then the first expansion went to 122 centers and 7,300 spaces across the province. Building on that, this plan would invest $1.5 billion over the next 5 years to ensure Alberta families can pay $25 a day per child for childcare, regardless of what their childcare costs are currently. Her plan would also address the backlog that currently exists by adding 13,000 spaces to the existing 62,000 spaces. Those are different numbers from what the Alberta Party was using. Not a surprise. Now we turn to the circus, the United Conservative Party. Again, I will go back to the promises part. Oh, where did I put? Oh, where did I put it? I need that article back. Ooh, excuse me. Here I am, flipping pages live. Yippee. No, not that part. Or is it that part? Okay. First, the promises from the United Conservative Party. Jason Klein. That's a nice start. Freudian slip almost. Jason Kenney was clear on parts of his conservative vision for Alberta before the UCP even existed, back when he was driving around in that blue truck drumming up support. Those ideas have since firmed up into policies, but Kenney's promised policy grassroots guarantee, upon which he campaigned to win leadership, has evaporated into thin air. The most ingrained UCP policy is killing off the provincial carbon tax, though Albertans will have to wait to hear the party's environment or greenhouse gas emission reduction plan. So far, Kenney has hinted at some kind of alternative to the carbon tax, such as the former progressive conservative government's levy on major emitters to, quote-unquote, support science and technology. Kenney has reneged on a UCP member-approved stance to take Alberta back to a flat tax, but said a UCP government would cut corporate taxes to 8% from 12% over the next 4 years. He has said repeatedly Alberta is in for a series of fiscal belt-tightening measures, but hasn't elaborated on what they might look like. If there is insufficient movement on the TMX pipeline by the fall of 2021, Kenney has also promised a referendum on removing equalization from the Constitution. Right. Energy and regulations. A UCP government would set up a $30 million taxpayer-funded war room to defend Alberta's energy industry here and abroad, setting up satellite offices if need be. It would also appoint a Minister of Deregulation, decreasing regulations by 1/3 across all ministries. Establish a $10 million litigation fund for pro-oil development First Nations. Push for a series of resource corridors to help with energy project approvals. And launch a public inquiry into foreign-funded efforts to undermine Alberta's energy industry. Okay, there's a lot of Doug Ford horse shit in there. First, we had Danielle Smith bitching about how Peter Lougheed was interfering in the market. What is this? How is this not interfering in the market? Kenney has also highlighted plans to immediately file a constitutional challenge should Bill C-69 become federal law. On oil, he said the UCP would support the use of turn off the taps legislation if there is no substantial work on pipelines. Another UCP tactic to push Ottawa for movement on pipelines would include holding a referendum on removing equalization. In healthcare, Kenney is pushing for private options in Alberta's healthcare system, much like the system in BC and Quebec. He would also kill the planned super lab project in Edmonton because he doesn't think a government should be rigid and ideological when it comes to healthcare. The UCP has also pledged a whopping $5 million to sexual assault centers. Unemployment. A UCP government would freeze minimum wage increases, repeal rules related to statutory holiday pay, and allow young workers to be paid less than their adult colleagues. It would also repeal Bill 6, the Farm Safety Act, and replace it with a Farm Freedom and Safety Act, which would allow farmers to choose where they buy workplace insurance for their employees and exempt small farms with 3 or fewer employees from employment legislation. So the law that allowed Alberta to be the last of 10 provinces to join protection for farm workers, Jason Goering's going to wipe that out. On the environment, Kenney plans to auction off around 100,000 acres of public land in Peace Country to the highest bidder, similar to a program under former Premier Ed Stelmach, and will consult on expanding the public land sell-off across the province. He has also hinted he will kill Energy Efficiency Alberta and the multitude of carbon tax-funded programs under the agency, leaving the province as the only jurisdiction in North America without an energy efficiency program. Kenney has also pledged to stop the statutory shutdown of coal. Federal regulations passed under Kenny's former government in Ottawa in 2012 would shutter most of Alberta's 18 coal-fired plants. The remaining 6 have to close by 2030 under a deadline set by Alberta's NDP government. The UCP also has a 13-point conservation plan, including a $30 annual trail fee and a 50% increase to the Alberta Land Trust Grant Program. Kenny has also promised the creation of an Alberta Parole Board, similar to the processes in place in Quebec and Ontario. And what the UCP won't do is consult with Albertans about its major plans. In October of last year, Kenny told a Calgary Chamber of Commerce luncheon he didn't want to get bogged down with public consultations. Instead, he's planning 100 days of change to roll back NDP policies. The UCP has already hired former public servants and a transition team to pen legislation so the party can avoid opposition and push through changes within days of forming government. So we know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be just like the Ford government in Ontario, ALEC influenced, Conservative Party influenced, boilerplate legislation. We know who it works for. Not Albertans. Oh my God. Now I'll see what Jason Markusov had to say about what's happening currently. Jason Kenney has promised multi-point plans to stick it to Ottawa, and his equalization reform push gets the most attention. But rejigging the equalization formula wouldn't directly benefit Alberta. It would merely give less to poorer provinces. The UCP plan is alarmingly different. Demand Ottawa stop giving provinces cash through the $55 billion Canada Health and Social Transfer, and instead transfer tax points. That is, lower federal income taxes by an equivalent amount and let provinces raise taxes to recoup it, or not, as they choose. This is one very powerful way of shrinking Ottawa's control over Alberta and being able to be masters of our own destiny. Now, I'll just step in and say that is a perfect way to defund vast amounts of public services. See? Ottawa's given our money back. It's about time. Oh, no, we don't have money. No, we got to sell that. The rich get richer. Do you think Kenny's going to raise Alberta taxes to make up for the federal shortfall, to allow for those revenues? Dream on. A giant problem for everyone else outside Kenny's current province. Ottawa's transfer program spends money on a per-person basis. So Alberta gets 12% of the total. Because Albertans are so much wealthier than everyone else on average, they contribute 19% of federal personal income taxes. To recoup the same amount for health care and other services, Alberta wouldn't have to raise taxes by as much as Ottawa lowers it. While some provinces must hike taxes by much more, Alberta would benefit by $500 per person, according to calculations by University of Calgary economist Trevor Tombe. So you got 4.2 million people times $500. Tombe says it screws over 7 of the provinces. It would be hard to imagine designing a reform that would benefit Alberta any more than this. No sane prime minister would agree to a move that exacerbates the very provincial disparities that equalization aims to smooth out. Nor would any province likely join Alberta in advocating for it. Perhaps it's an extreme shoot-for-Mars bargaining chip by Kenny. It's certainly one that signals how the would-be premier intends to wield Alberta's disproportionately large resource-based wealth within Confederation. Now I'm going to get to their policy. I hope I can get through this in the 2 hours. It's quite a crock of shit. We'll see. This is from the UCP's website. And, of course, they can't put the party name in the website. That's too simple. Got to sloganize everything. Alberta Strong and Free.ca. This is about jobs. The job creation tax cut is the centerpiece of the UCP job creation strategy to reignite the economy and get Alberta back to work. Economists estimate that this one-third cut to the business tax would create at least 55,000 jobs and grow Alberta's economy by $13 billion. The NDP recklessly hiked taxes on job creators by 20% in the middle of a recession. Now 170,000 Albertans are out of work. Tens of thousands have given up looking for work. The average family's take-home pay is down by $6,400 since the NDP came to office, and unemployment has been on the rise for 6 of the past 8 months. Let's break that down a little bit. The average family's take-home pay is down by $6,400. Well, when you have massive layoffs, guess what that does to the average, dickhead? Quit making it sound like everybody's losing money. They're not. Sure sounds good. Now 170,000 Albertans are out of work. How many were out of work in 2015? More than that. Before even tabling a budget in the legislature, the NDP raised Alberta's corporate income tax from 10% to 12%, effectively raising business taxes by 1/5 and thereby limiting their ability to sustain and create jobs. This single action destroyed Alberta's tax advantage. When Alberta's 12% tax was combined with the 15% federal business tax, that 27% tax rate took us from among the lowest in Canada to middle of the pack. Oh no, middle of the pack. Then he makes perspective of international competitiveness. 32 out of 50 American states impose lower tax burdens on business than Alberta. Who fucking cares? Alberta's NDP government has imposed so much new and onerous regulation that here's an impartial source, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business dropped Alberta's already poor red tape grade from D to F. Oh no, what a surprise. The NDP were warned. In 2015, Canada's leading tax policy expert, economist Dr. Jack Mintz, warned that every 1% rise in the tax on businesses could cost 8,900 jobs, a conservative estimate of the potential job losses. Every extra $1 in taxes on business cost the Alberta economy more. Dr. Bev Dalby, another real impartial source, estimates that for every extra dollar in higher business taxes, that extra $1 cost the economy $3.39. Economists call this the deadweight effect. It's also bullshit. The NDP's higher taxes on job creators hurt the private sector. Between May 2015 and January 2019, the extra 20,900 Alberta jobs are all government jobs. Over the last 4 years, private sector employment shrank by 16,500 jobs. Meanwhile, government jobs are up by 37,400 positions. That is based on definitions. It is ridiculously deceptive. I'll leave it at that. Then they make a ridiculous comparison about energy capital investment. Investment in Alberta is down dramatically and still dropping. No, it's not. Among the energy companies that have closed up shop in Alberta since 2015 are Royal Dutch Shell, ConocoPhillips, Kinder Morgan, Marathon Oil, Chevron, Murphy Oil, Apache, Statoil, Total SA, and just announced Devon Energy. This cannot be blamed on the initial drop in oil prices. No, it's not. It's based on them understanding that oil sands is not profitable going forward. State the truth. The last thing they want after ExxonMobil took a $6 billion hit in 1 year from the Security and Exchange Commission, we don't want stranded assets. Sell. That's got nothing to do with the government. It's got nothing to do with the price of oil. It's got to do with the writing on the wall. Then he goes on to say, in Texas, for example, things are booming. You just can't compare them. But of course, the fix is to reduce taxes. It's got nothing to do with the shit bitumen in the ground. It's got nothing to do with anything else, environmental standards, nothing. It's all because of the business tax. There are quotes from experts who say what a great idea this latest attempt at trickle down will not accomplish. Montreal Economic Institute, private financial outfits. Just same old shit. Trickle down. Nothing new. A fair deal for Alberta. Equalization reform. Again, talk about a referendum that has absolutely no effect, no weight, no legal status. Fairness in the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. Convert Canada Health Transfer and Canada Social Transfer to tax points. We know what that's about. Here's another one that all conservative parties like to use that is simply, in my opinion, a misnomer. What they call the Trudeau-Notley payroll tax hike. Rachel Notley signed a deal with her ally Justin Trudeau to raise CPP payroll taxes on Albertans. Canada Pension Plan is not a payroll tax. Idiot. Asshole. It's an investment. The government recognized that not enough Canadians have saved for their retirement, so they're increasing these rates by 1 percentage point. So a UCP government will simply just tell Alberta business they don't have to collect the extra point. He wants fairness in employment insurance. Everybody knows how EI works. The more you make, the more you pay in premiums. You reach your maximum, you get back any premiums you overpaid. Everybody has the same goddamn maximum. But according to the UCP, Alberta pays more into the employment insurance system than it gets back. Well, isn't that what everybody aims for? Something that's come out lately is the stress test involved with the federal budget and home ownership. The UPC wants Alberta exempt from the CMHC stress test. That's a ridiculous demand. If you want the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation to use that program to supply funds for ownership of property in Alberta, you can't be expected to skip the stress test. Ridiculous. Create pre-approved, guaranteed land corridors for Canadian products. This just screams unconstitutionality. A UCP government will seek to form federal and provincial agreement on resource corridors. These would be pre-approved land coordinators moving east, west, and north in the Arctic. While satisfying Indigenous environmental and legal obligations, these corridors will expedite the approval process for resource projects. How? You're nuts. And calls for what he calls a Charter of Economic Rights, whatever the hell that is. and a call for a Alberta parole board because, tough on crime, herder. Just like Ford, he's promised to make a minister of cutting red tape. I don't really understand it. There is something on their website that they're going to cut red tape by 1/3. We've heard this before. Ralph Klein did this. A certain percentage of regulations had to be cut. Didn't matter what they did, what they were for. Ford's doing it. Mike Harris did it. Walkerton, anybody? Of course, the people lining up behind it, the Alberta Chamber of Commerce, the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, that fine organization, Restaurants Canada, ATB, Alberta Treasury Branch, the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, and surprise, surprise, the Fraser Institute. What a surprise. The Red Tape Reduction Act, modeled on laws in other provinces, read Ontario. A dedicated minister for red tape reduction who will lead the action plan to be stuffed with cronies and people we owe jobs to. Industry panels to inform red tape reduction. One in, one out rule, requiring agencies or ministries proposing new regulations to identify at least one offsetting regulation for elimination. So basically that mandates you cannot improve protections. An outcome-based regulatory approach. So that means an approval-based regulatory approach. There's nothing new here. It's all the same old bullshit, Randian, Randroid bullshit, trickle-down garbage. The biggest joke is what they call strengthening democracy. They'll introduce recall legislation. They're getting big money out of politics. It already is. But they want to go after people outside of that. So that's just what they call it. Fixed election dates, down to the day. How ridiculous. More bullshit about free votes, banning floor crossing, which is unconstitutional. Bringing back Senate elections, complete waste of money. A Taxpayer Protection Act, which is basically putting shackles on the unknown future. Same old garbage. And that doesn't even get into the problems with this party socially. I'm running out of time. I'm not going to get to everything in the 2 hours. I get in what I can. March 23rd, thecable.co. Far-right white nationalism has infected Jason Kenney's Conservative Party. This is just a short list of who we do know and action has been taken. Adam Strashok, a Kennedy campaign worker who ran the call center for Kennedy's UCP leadership campaign. Strashok founded a white nationalist e-commerce store, consumed videos from neo-Nazi supporter Faith Goldy, and promoted anti-Semitic views. Nicole Williams and Layla Houle, UCP candidates who posed with members of the Soldiers of Olden, a well-known hate group. Both candidates claim to be unaware of the group's far-right beliefs. Grant Hunter, UCP candidate who claimed there is something special about the people of Cardston. And it was likely because they're reared from superior stock. Though he did admit that thought reeks of Aryan undertones. Now, to tell the truth, it reeks of Mormon superiority bullshit. Lance Coulter, a UCP nomination candidate who defended his appearance in a photo with the Soldiers of Odin, even though he knew it was a white nationalist organization. Phil Schumann, UCP nomination candidate who offered to fund a neo-Nazi Instagram account. The account shared anti-Semitic posts, including graphics that praised Nazism and Adolf Hitler. More recently this week, this is from Karen Levitt, who's been doing a good job for the Star in Edmonton. This is the latest regarding Kaylin Ford and Eva Kyriakos, two UCP candidates who stepped down for expressing white nationalist and Islamophobic views online, will not be removed from the party, Leader Jason Kenney said. Of course, we got the usual dodging that, we can't go back on everybody, despite him a few months ago saying they would go back on everybody. We know why Kyriakos stepped down, because she was worried that things would be exposed. Now apparently she's a victim and has been bullied. Kenney said last year the party had a rigorous vetting process to avoid the kind of bozo eruptions that helped sink the now defunct right-wing Wild Rose in 2012. Now, when the issue of Adam Strashuk came out, Kenney asked the UCP board to develop a process for screening applicants to block anyone who has expressed hateful or extreme views. What happened to that? Now, Kyriakos has doubled down on her hateful comments in a video explaining her resignation. Her comments included a claim of fake refugee rape crisis that was linked from a WordPress blog, and a false claim that allowing transgender people to use the washrooms that align with their gender leads to girls being assaulted by men. And David Dorward, a usual suspect for these kind of idiotic comments, a candidate in Edmonton, has recently said the same thing. Kaylin Ford has remained active on Twitter, has not apologized for her remarks, but she is somewhat saddened by the demographic replacement of white peoples in their homelands. There's nothing going to change this. It's going to keep going. Of course, the play is if they step down as candidates, it deflects from the party. But Kenney allowing them to remain party members is just splitting hairs. Now, in the last minute of the live show, I'm going to keep going for a little bit. It will be in the archive. It will be on the YouTube when it's made, unless Blog Talk Radio loses it again. But otherwise, this was the opener. Going to have some guests in the next couple of weeks. We're going to get into the Alberta election. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week on the View Up Here. Now I keep going. As far as the UCP healthcare policy goes, there is some surprising change in the corporate press in Alberta, just like there was last time, right before the election. It's happening much sooner this time. Granted, not from the Calgary Sun, but from the Calgary Herald. Don Braid. Yesterday, UCP healthcare policy invites return to PC-era chaos. I'm featuring this because it brings up some good things. Healthcare isn't a giant issue in this election campaign. Not yet, anyway. But it may once again hit the heights when the dire risks of UCP health promises seek in. Jason Kenney's party would freeze health spending. Any fresh funding for the front lines would come from cash saved through cuts to administration or unexpected improvements to the fiscal picture. That's not going to work. In fact, it guarantees a return to the chaos of the progressive conservative years. And maybe worse, because there would be no panic spending spikes to save the day. This seems to be slipping under voter radar because healthcare is no longer a hair-pulling crisis. Healthcare was a much bigger deal in elections past. Now it isn't top of mind. Why? Because the NDP calmed down the system, made significant improvements, and provided stability for health planners, professionals, and workers. The giant complex healthcare structure now costs Alberta $22 billion a year. It's expensive and far from perfect, as the NDP will admit. Some wait times are even growing. But healthcare access and delivery are far more level and reliable than they were in 2015. That was essential after a decade of erratic funding and political interference from PC ministers who couldn't keep their hands off. That would also include current Alberta Party leader Stephen Mandel, who was the final health minister for the PCs. The NDP has also eliminated the PC's messy public fights over who runs the system. Shortly after winning in 2015, the NDP picked a board of able people who understood the government is the ultimate boss, period. So there's no point arguing over policy or direction. The NDP promised and delivered relatively modest but consistent funding hikes equivalent to population growth plus inflation, between 3 and 4% annually. In the dying progressive conservative years, spending increases spiked from 4% to more than 6%, then down to 2%, and then up to nearly 7%. If oil prices dropped, a patient could almost expect the IV to drain out. Staffing and programs were flatlined, resuscitated, and then put through the same survival cycle again. It was chaotic for doctors, nurses, and too often for patients. Now the UCP proposes something even worse, real-world cuts, with no apparent hope of a corresponding hike the next year. Holding the line on funding means the system loses to inflation, a 1.5% value drop every year. That's without counting the extra demands of population growth and aging. A UCP freeze would thus reduce real-world healthcare resources by about 3% annually. Unless, that is, a UCP government could make up the difference by cutting administration, after a review of Alberta Health Services to be completed by December 31st. By finding efficiencies everywhere, but relying mostly on administrative and management cuts, Kenney hopes to save between $350 and $450 million. Even if he can do that, the funding gap created by a freeze can never be filled. Kenney could fire every single executive, manager, planner, and coordinator and eliminate the whole network of central services for Alberta Health Services, and still only save enough to keep frontline funding stable for 1 year. Alberta's health administration costs as a percentage of spending are the lowest of any province at 3.3%. The national average is 4.5%. Ontario is by far the worst at 5.8%. Alberta spends $726 million a year on administration. Recouping every penny, not that it's even possible, could only happen once. After that, the system would still be left with frozen funding that is actually a major funding loss every year. While signing his health care guarantee, Kenney said, "If we can find the money, there will be increases in the health budget. There will be no cuts." Sure. Now, there was something I had to miss in Edmonton tonight. It has ended now, about an hour and a half ago probably. There was a protest rally at the Alberta legislature about the UCP policy to change the legislation regarding GSAs, gay straight alliances. That is the big issue right now. And there are some that are saying that this may be a step too far. This was a huge issue in the defeat of the Prentice government in 2015 to Rachel Notley and the NDP. Kenney is nearing a tipping point. Sorry. This was all revealed in the election platform reveal from the UCP, which happened on Monday. This is from the Edmonton Journal. Janet French, Sammy Hoods, Emma Graney. A UCP government would proclaim a 7-year-old piece of education legislation, turfing some legal protections for Alberta LGBTQ students and school staff introduced by the NDP government. UCP leader Jason Kenney said if elected to government, his party would replace Alberta's School Act with the former PC government's Education Act. It would eliminate changes the NDP introduced with Bill 24, which requires school principals to immediately grant student requests to form a gay-straight alliance, and requires private schools to have publicly available policies to protect LGBTQ students. Here's Kenny's first quote. We want safe schools. We want peer support for kids who need it, and I think we can do it while respecting the basic religious freedom of faith-based independent schools. This move would return to law to how it read in 2015 after the former PC government passed its Bill 10. Those changes compelled all school principals, public and private, to establish a GSA or similar extracurricular club when a student requested one, and said students could choose a respectful club name. Bill 10 did not require private schools to adopt policies that affirmed students' human rights or spell out the consequences for bullying other students. Right now, all schools are required to post those policies prominently online and in school buildings. Sarah Hoffman is the Minister of Health and the NDP candidate for Edmonton-Glenora. She said, this is a way for him to absolutely undo the protections that we've done in ensuring that kids in GSAs can't be outed without him having to necessarily go in and overturn that. Just replace it with a piece of legislation that is very outdated and doesn't reflect the values of today's Alberta. Now, of course, Bill 24 is law currently. The entire UCP caucus refused to even vote on it and left the legislature. Now, opponents said Bill 24 allows school staff to keep secrets from families. Some independent schools have defied the law and refused to adopt compliant policies, for which Education Minister David Egan has given them a deadline or their funding will be revoked. The law is the law. A group of private religious schools, parents, and others, John Carpe, are challenging the law in court. Bringing in the Education Act by September 2019 would reverse the changes introduced by Bill 28, which requires teachers meet new quality standards, requires all kindergartners in Alberta turn 5 years old by December 31st, and gives the Education Minister the power to require overlapping school boards cooperate on student transportation. Passed by the legislature in 2012, but never proclaimed, the Education Act would raise the age of free public schooling to 21 from 19, raise the dropout age to 17 from 16, and define a student's residency by the student's address, not the family address. Urban school boards with packed schools fret about the change in residency, saying it could cause problems for schools with closed attendance boundaries. That is a very important thing. There are some schools that have attendance boundaries that cannot be changed, and they have students that live outside it. There are provisions for that, but what they're seeing here is if the parents live within the school's zone and the student moves somewhere else, either moving out in high school or what have you, or a split in the family, and goes with one parent or goes independently, doesn't change schools, but is now outside that school zone, that school loses funding for that student. That doesn't make sense. There's also bringing in mandatory grade 3 achievement tests. He would pause the K-12 curriculum review. He wants to broaden consultations, include a wider range of perspectives, and ensure social studies contains more Alberta and Canadian history and geography. He wants to whiten everything. He wants to heterosexualize everything. Now, the NDP counters that the $64 million curriculum rewrite was the most open consultative exercise yet, and included the feedback and input of tens of thousands of Albertas. Currently, the arts curriculum is more than 30 years old. Kenney also repeated a pledge to lift a 1990s provincial cap of 15 charter schools. He said a UCP government would affirm parents' right to choose the best education for their child and maintain current public funding rates for private and charter schools, which is 70% in Alberta, which is ridiculous. So he's not going to increase the percentage of funding, he's just going to allow more. There's one taxpayer, there's one school tax. Guess what suffers? Public schools. Another article about the earlier shift from corporate media away from the party line. Edmonton Journal. Today, Keith Guerin. Kenney walks risky tightrope with GSA policy. Ever since Jason Kenney entered Alberta's political stage 2 years ago, he's been kept on his toes, catering to competing interests within this so-called big tent conservative movement. The balancing act has been evident in his grassroots guarantee of taking policy direction from UCP faithful, while also vowing to overrule ideas he sees as destructive to the party. Such tightrope walking has also been apparent in his courting of both social conservatives and progressives, a trick he's attempted by suggesting he has moved on from his old anti-LGBTQ and abortion advocacy, while simultaneously avoiding any apologies or explanations of how his views have evolved. This last high-wire act has been the most slippery of all, and Kenney may have taken an irreversible misstep with the education platform he unveiled this week that would roll back key protections on gay-straight alliances. Of all the UCP policies to come out so far, this is the one Mr. Guerin sees as most essential for Albertans to understand what Kenney's values are and where his loyalties lie. When finally forced to make a choice on a social issue with little middle ground, he gave a nod towards those on the religious right, many of whom still cling to the misguided view that homosexuality is something to be feared and shamed. We'll see what Albertans have to say on April 16th. But Mr. Guerin's suspicion is that by kicking this hornet's nest again, Kenney has badly misread the room on GSAs and failed to learn from the fractious history of this issue that tripped up his PC predecessors. His decision also provides a gift to Rachel Notley at a time the NDP desperately needs one. Just when the NDP was taking flack for an ugly campaign focused on Kenney's anti-LGBTQ past, the UCP leader has delivered a policy that makes his rivals look more like prophets than prosecutors. The way Kenney chose to announce his education platform was also telling, as if he knew trouble might be coming. Instead of mentioning GSAs by name, the UCP leader made the bizarre announcement that his party would bring into force the Education Act, an old, unproclaimed bill devised by the PCs that has been on the legislative scrap heap for the last 7 years. In this case, the ultimate effect of switching the acts would be to eliminate changes made by the NDP under Bill 24 and return the province to the law as it was under Bill 10. Under Bill 24, if a student requests a GSA, their principal must grant one, quote unquote, immediately. Under Bill 10, there is no time requirement. Under Bill 24, private schools became subject to the same requirement as public schools in having to create and post policies. Bill 10 had no such demand for private schools. Kenny said Tuesday his party is not against asking schools to publish their policies, but that's a far cry from requiring schools to publish policy. The UCP leader then went on to blast the NDP for threatening to remove funding from religious schools for publishing pretty banal statements of faith. On this issue, Mr. Guerin is interested to know what Kenny considers banal. Here's a little bit of religious messaging used by one school. Biblical distinctions, such as those between children and their parents, as well between men and women, must be maintained. And biblical marriage is the only legitimate and acceptable context for sexual intimacy. Banal in 2019? What Bill 24 did was lay it out in law that there will be no informing parents membership in a GSA. That's a blanket, it's concrete, it protects those that would pay the price from parents who are not willing to accept. Going back to Bill 10 removes that. Kenny described that as a blunt instrument. He said a UCP government would encourage GSAs, but would leave it up to highly trained teachers to decide when and if to inform parents. Now, Mr. Guerin says, firstly, this puts teachers in an awful position where making the wrong decision could have life-changing consequences. If Kenny talked to more teachers, he might find a preference for a blanket prohibition. And it's a bit rich for Kenny to say he trusts teachers' expertise to handle such situations, when he clearly doesn't trust their expertise on the government's curriculum review, nor their ability to determine the most appropriate teaching method for their classes. Freedom of religion is an important tenet of Canadian democracy, and parents have the right to raise their children in accordance with religious values. But when that right comes into conflict with the need to protect the safety of LGBTQ students, there is no contest. Whether intended or not, the effect of Kenny's proposal is to offer a beacon to those who practice homophobia at a time when Albertan values are going the opposite direction. Concerns about the economy may be enough to carry his party to victory this time, but the UCP's misguided platform has the potential to cause long-term discord with the youngest generation of voters, who polls indicate are already anxious about the UCP. I would tend to agree with Mr. Guerin and other notable people on social media, Mike Morris and Dr. Christopher Wells among them, is a deal breaker. This is too far. This has to be controlled. I had more content about the RCMP investigation and the back and forth with emails and who cooperated and who didn't and where'd the money come from, etc. That will be covered in the next couple of Alberta election shows with guests. The last thing I want to say tonight, there was a tweet that came across my timeline last night I'm not going to say the account. I'm not sure I have the license to do so. It was in reply to me and a couple other people. Tell me again why we have to replace a scandal-free, racist-free, competent government with this collection of bigoted fuck-ups. That is one of the best questions I have seen so far in this entire campaign. Before I go off the air, I just want to say that the show I did regarding the scandal about a scandal, Blog Talk Radio has now confirmed, as I knew from the very beginning, they have lost the last 19 minutes of the show. When I get time, I will remake those 19 minutes, since I know exactly where it ended and I have all my materials. Once that is done, I will splice it on, and then I will make the YouTube for that episode. Next couple weeks, Alberta election. That's all for tonight. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on The View Up Here. Good night.